welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to our Language Teachers Forum. I wear two hats here, so it's both under the auspices of Griffith University, so welcome on behalf of Griffith University and also the Modern Language Teachers Association of Queensland. We're doing quite a few things together. On Sunday we had the inaugural multi-language speech contest at Nathan campus, and we had 7 languages, including Russian, for I think the first time at a speech contest in Queensland, and we had 444 students compete, which was quite good for the first year, and I think we're only going to grow. And then in 2 weeks' time, on the 18th, we have our Gold Coast Language Speech Contest, which is the major sponsor is Griffith University as well. We usually get about 1,200 students to that, but it may be a little less perhaps this year because with the Brisbane contest we've made a rule.
And that's primary and secondary as well?
It's primary and secondary, yeah. The Nathan one was secondary. We've made a rule that if your school's in the Brisbane City Council area, you must go to the Brisbane competition. If it's in the Gold Coast one, you must go there. If it's in surrounding cities and shires, then you can make a choice. Although I've heard primary Japanese at the Gold Coast is up to 300, which is the all-time record just for primary Japanese, so maybe we won't be getting too much smaller. At Gold Coast we've got Jugendbear in for the first time because it's the United Nations International Year of Indigenous Languages as well. And I don't know if you know, but Borrowby, that was the Commonwealth Games mascot, has now become the Jugendbear language champion. And he's going around to schools trying to encourage students to learn Indigenous languages. Jugendbear is the Gold Coast language, or the area I think from Binglee down, although he's available to help with any Indigenous languages right through Australia. So Borrowby himself will be at the Gold Coast speech contest this year, so that should be quite exciting. And we have a page of him, a picture of him on the on our new journal. Marcel and I, as well as running this Language Teachers Forum, we're now the joint editors of the MLTAQ journal. So the winter edition, we have a winter edition and summer edition. Winter edition, it's supposed to be winter at the moment, apparently it was 29 in Brisbane today, but we do have some cooler days still coming up. The winter edition is about to go to the presses, and then we'll have a summer edition at the end of the year too. It's the 60th anniversary of the MLTAQ this year, so we're having a special dinner at the Greek Club in South Brisbane on the 18th of October, if you'd like to join us at that. And we're also doing awards. So any MLTAQ member in Queensland may nominate another languages teacher for an award for the 60th anniversary. If you're not a member and would like to be, you can go to mltaq.asn for association.au and sign up and become a member there. So already getting quite a few people coming in. So you can talk to me if you don't know about that and would like some more information on that. So yes, we also do the Languages Teachers Forum. And just before I forget, Jessica's here over here from the International Service Unit of EQ International, and she's brought along some brochures with all sorts of opportunities, international opportunities for languages teachers. So she'll have those available at the end if you'd like to get one from her, and maybe you could talk to her about that. So back to the Language Teachers Forum. It's my great pleasure to introduce Susana, one of my colleagues from Griffith University, who's an international expert on home language maintenance and bilingualism. And this is her second presentation at the Language Teachers Forum, one a couple of years ago, which was very, very popular, as has been today. So we've got quite a few people virtually in the room, and who'll be watching this video as well. So thank you very much for coming, Susana.
Thank you for the invitation, Marcel and Lee. It's a pleasure to be here. It was 5 years ago. I started looking at my notes and I said, it's been 5 years. I couldn't believe how quickly the time went. Okay, so today this is the plan, what I would like to talk about today, the degree of bilingualism, what is bilingualism, how can we define it, why would you raise a bilingual child, the benefits and perceived disadvantages or challenges, and finally I want to talk about some initiatives to support home language maintenance. So before we start, how many of you are bilingual? Can I see a show of hands? Okay, can I just phrase it differently? How many of you speak more than one language? Okay, so you see a different number of people raising their hand, and I think this leads me very nicely into the first topic I want to discuss.
Oh, a couple online as well. Good.
Okay, yes, and this still a problem. So this really leads very nicely into the first topic. What is bilingualism, and why is it that when you ask people how many of you are bilinguals, you see some people raising their hand, but if you said how many speak more than one language, you see many people raising hands. So, this is going to be very, okay. So, one of the first definitions is, or the quick definition is the ability to speak two languages. But as we know, some people don't speak two languages, but they can understand two languages. So this is not enough. What we do know is that...
There's a little bit of a delay here, so sorry.
Okay,
Yeah.
doesn't matter. So what we do know is that about half of the population in the world is bilingual, if not multilingual. And I'm going to be talking about bilingualism, but everything I said more or less relates to multilingualism as well. Okay, defining bilinguals, however, is quite problematic. One of the first definitions is very old, from the 1930s, someone who has native-like control in two languages. Now, if I ask people who said here they're bilingual, how many of you have native-like control?
That's why we're...
You will see that, yeah, it's not, again, it changes. I wouldn't say I have native-like control in English as I have in Spanish. So...
Then the rest of us, yeah, no trouble. Okay. Do you want me to do that? Do
you know
want
what,
to tell me and
maybe,
yeah.
Right. Okay. So this is basically what we call the mythical bilingual, although we have some people here, so it's not just mythical. Basically, this would be a person who speaks and has a level of competence in language A that is equal as the level of competence in language B. For most of us, this is not the case.
Is that all right? You wanted me to click? Yep.
Yeah, if you don't mind. For most of us, we are somewhere in a continuum. So you might have a monolingual language A, monolingual language B at the other end, and most of us will be somewhere in this continuum. Okay. Now, another definition, on the other extreme, we have the native-like control of two languages. On the other extreme, we have Edward's definition, and he says everyone is bilingual, because everyone will know how to say a few words in a different language. You can say Guten Tag, Konnichiwa, sushi, she, and you're bilingual. So I guess for most of us, this wouldn't be an accepted definition of bilingualism, although it's quite a... Yeah, I'll take it, but it's really probably not. And he said, well, the question, of course, is one of degree. And this is really the central question on bilingualism. What is the degree? So, another definition, Miller, he's talking about someone who operates through their everyday life in more than one language and does so with some degree of self-competence or confidence. How do we measure that? What does it mean to have some degree of confidence when you speak the language? And finally, leeway, and of course we have as many definitions as researchers, but leeway says anyone who can communicate in more than one language. Be it active through speaking or writing, or passive through listening and reading. Okay, so that again seems to be okay, but it's still very vague. So the moral of the story is that defining bilingualism is not really an easy task. It's quite complicated, and it raises many different issues. For example, most of you are teaching a foreign language. Are your students bilinguals? Are L2 learners bilinguals? At what stage would you say that the child acquiring a language becomes a bilingual in that language? Some people talk about emergent bilinguals. When do they become bilinguals? And to make it even more interesting, we have different levels of proficiency. How do we measure linguistic proficiency or linguistic competence? Native-like proficiency is not self-explanatory because, as we know, some people are more confident and more proficient in their own native language than others. I don't want to name any presidents here, but you probably get what I mean. Yep. So Klein defined it very well. He said even a monolingual perfect command of their language is difficult to define. How do we define native-like proficiency or competent? And in which macro skills? Which dimension? As you know, from if you're teaching scripted languages, your students might be very fluent, or you might know fluent people who cannot read or write. Are they bilingual? So there are a number of issues that need to be considered. Which dimensions? Is there a minimum threshold to qualify as a bilingual? And in that case, in which skills? Even writing, according to Edwards, even when you're looking at writing, you're looking at least at 20 micro skills. Fluency, orthography, style, vocabulary, etc., syntax. So it is quite complex when you start to try to measure it. Another issue that we need to discuss is how much input do children need? I'm actually writing a paper on that topic now, and the researchers are all over the place. How much input, and is input the same as exposure? If you're teaching a foreign language in a school, how many hours of exposure do children get in that language? How many hours of exposure do our university students get in a foreign language? Is this enough to qualify them as bilinguals? And what about pragmatics and sociocultural competence? Because we've been talking about linguistic areas, but what about pragmatics? Most of us will probably transfer somehow our pragmatic conventions into our second language. When do you acquire this competence, pragmatic competence, in particular when you are living in a country where you're studying the target language as a foreign language? It's a different situation with the migrants coming to Australia and acquiring English, but if your students are studying Japanese, how can they be expected to acquire pragmatic languages? So the definition seems to assume that bilingualism mostly refers to a linguistic phenomenon, but as we know, there are many non-linguistic dimensions to speaking a language. So a way forward, instead of trying to define definition, is to use descriptors. So, for example, China Wigglesworth said bilingual is not a concrete entity that can be quantified or dissected. So instead of talking about how to measure it, looking at the dimensions or at the descriptions that play a role in acquiring a language. So the descriptors, and this is how we can start to look at bilingual speakers. A number of descriptors. The age of onset, when do they start acquiring a language? As you know, it's very different when you're acquiring a language from birth, as if you're acquiring a language before puberty or after puberty or in adulthood. The context of acquisition, is it the home? Is it the school? Is it a formal environment? The degree of bilingualism, how much the person, that's okay, how much a person can do in every one of the skills. So one of the proposed descriptors, and again there are many different ones, suggests describing bilinguals in terms of 4 areas. One is the origin, which language is acquired first, the competence, which language the speaker knows best, knowing, understanding that this is still a very difficult area to define. which language speakers use it the most, so functions. And finally, identification, which language is used to associate and disassociate from others. This becomes very important in migrant communities. Do children or young adults feel associated with that language or not? So this is just one form of trying to encapsulate the phenomenon of bilingualism. Another one is by Leung, Harris, and Rampton. They talk about 3 dimensions: language expertise, this is competence; language inheritance, this is your ancestors; and then language affiliation, which language do you feel close to. Now, this might seem like a way forward, but it's still quite problematic, because these dimensions are really places in a continuum. They are not really that clear-cut. In many cases, it's very difficult to say where one begins and the other finishes. It is very difficult to draw clear boundaries, also because the dimensions interact with one another. And in many cases, one is dependent on one another. The functions, for example, of language depend on your level of competence. So if you are very fluent in a language and very proficient in a language, you will be able to use this language in a number of functions that you wouldn't if you don't have a level of competence. So even though this seems to be a way forward, it's still difficult. So competence and use interact, obviously. You can speak more about certain things if you have the vocabulary to do that in that language. So, and the other issue to remember is that bilingualism is a dynamic phenomenon. It changes across your lifetime. So my daughter's first language, for example, was Spanish. But when she started going to childcare center, English became her dominant language. So the first language in terms of origin ended up not being the first language in terms of competence. So this is a big moment of suspense because I don't know what is coming. Okay, so all this just to say there is a reason why people don't know whether to raise their hand when you ask them if they're bilinguals or not, because there are so many issues with defining bilinguals. But in any case, and this is one of the questions that if you ask people, are you a bilingual, they might say yes or no. Everyone has some intuition, but the problem is when you have to define it and categorize it, that you realize it's very complex, and it's a very complex phenomenon. But why would you even try to raise bilingual children? Or in your case, you're educating children who are bilingual, according to some definitions at least of bilingualism, if you accept the minimum threshold. Well, there are many myths and misconceptions about bilingualism, so I think it's better to start with that. And you might have heard this sort of myth: the children will be confused. Have you ever heard that? Yes, especially with with parents raising young children, with babies, for example. They said, oh, it's better to introduce one language first and then the other, because otherwise the babies will be confused. Well, this is not the case, and I'm going to give you some evidence in a while. Children will mix languages. Have you heard that one? Yeah. Do they mix languages? Yes. Is it a problem? Well, apparently it's not that big a problem as people fear. It is important to learn first one language and then the other. Well, there are reasons why this is not necessarily the case. The children's English will suffer. This is something that we hear all the time, and I even hear it from colleagues of mine who teach languages. Well, the English is not going to suffer, the English is going to benefit. Yes?
Allow me to comment. I have Swiss friends who left Australia as a result of this. They had a young child going into primary school, and the primary school teacher insisted that they stop speaking French and Italian at home, because the poor child would be unable to get any literacy until they mastered English properly. They got so angry about it, they actually went back to Switzerland.
Okay.
There at least
where everyone speaks 3 or 4 languages, and no one really worries about that. I'm going to have something to say soon about this issue. Okay, and a few more myths, because there are many myths about bilingual children. And remember, this is not the case. The children will have problems with reading and writing. If they speak more than two languages might be okay, more than two languages, except in Switzerland and many other countries where this is commonly done. It doesn't work. It's too late now. And I hear this from many parents, oh, well, my child is 6 now, too late. It's never too late, we know that. Okay, but why do we advocate for children becoming bilinguals? Well, from a child perspective, there are many things to say. Now, on the other hand, I do have to make a disclaimer. Everything I'm going to say assumes that there is assumes the interdependency theory, which means that the children have to have a certain threshold in the 2 languages or more languages to gain these benefits. So just knowing a couple of words in a foreign language is not going to benefit the child, but having a minimum threshold of competence in 2 or more languages will be very beneficial. So home language development and maintenance is something that is very important for us, and unless the children get that from the home, it's really going to be very difficult for parents to raise bilingual children. They cannot just trust on the Sunday school or Saturday school here, community centers or schools. There is a lot of evidence, particularly from Canada and the States, that having a good level of proficiency in your home language is actually a benefit for the acquisition of the majority language, in this case English. So English is not going to suffer, it's going to benefit. And what I tell parents all the time, don't worry about English. English will take care of itself. You know, English is protected. When Lobianco and Michael Klein used to look at the language attrition in the census, it's always the minority languages, it's never English. So this is quite a clear evidence. But there are many cognitive and educational benefits for children. One is that they get a higher general academic achievement. If they acquire more languages, they have better analytical skills because they're constantly comparing, metalinguistic awareness of how languages work, phonological awareness, what are the sounds of the language, the ability to decode and interpret text, working memory is enhanced, improved concentration because they're multitasking, they constantly have to use the executive control areas of the brain to stop one language and use the other. So this is executive control. And a transfer of skills, for example, literacy. There is enough evidence now that indicates that if children acquire literacy in their strongest language, they will benefit in acquiring literacy in other languages, even in scripted languages when the scripts are different. And this is because children acquire literacy once. It doesn't happen twice. You don't learn to read twice. You learn to read once, because learning to read is understanding that these little drawings represent some meaning. Once you have it in your first language, it's easy to transfer into other languages. So this is work by Bialystok, but I also wrote about that. So cognitive benefits of bilingualism, you can see that you have them in every level of development. With young children, it benefits cognition, life skills, test scores. In adulthood, high earning, college success, employability, and eventually in health as well. You all know that NAPLAN, there is evidence for NAPLAN that bilingual children do very well, although there might be other elements as well there, but certainly bilingualism doesn't impede children from doing well in school. In addition to the cognitive and the educational benefits, there are many other benefits. One is the affective and the social advantages. The sense of self-help and self-worth, and identity comes from learning the language and from knowing the language that the parents speak. Valuing the heritage, the culture, and the minority language, having greater appreciation for other cultures, and the potential to reduce intergenerational conflict and alienation. That is something that has been documented in teenagers that don't speak the home language, and suddenly there is this clash between the children and the parents and the grandparents. This is, I'm not saying that you're not going to have problems with teenagers, but it's not going to, this has some potential to improve the situation. Future prospects, better jobs and career outcomes. Well, as we know here, all of us are making a profession because we have skills in other languages. The ability to live abroad, learning languages is later easier in life because you already have the understanding of how language works. And you probably are familiar with this research by Bilingualistic showing that continuous use of two languages delays mental decline by 4 years. Now, if you speak more than two languages,
4 years.
4 years from the onset. So this is basically looking at two brains that are damaged to the same degree, and 4 years later you see that the decline is there. It's not going to prevent Alzheimer's, but it gives you 4 years of a breather. Two languages 4 years. Unfortunately, no. Would be nice. Now, the advantages are there also for people who acquire language later in life. So, you know, this is a good advertisement for people to go out and acquire languages later. More languages don't buy you more years, unfortunately, because apparently this is, you know, it's the executive control in the brain that you are exercising constantly. This is what buys you the time. Okay. And from the parents and carers perspective, we have communication with family members, and this is something that I find in my research. Many people said, I want my children to speak the language because otherwise they wouldn't be able to communicate with the parents and the grandparents. They can access the culture, the language, art, etc., literature, film, and emotional involvement with the families. So this is from the point of view of the parents. Now think about your own situations. Would you, if you are a speaker of another language, would you be comfortable speaking English in Australia with your child? I would find it very difficult, for example, because all the songs I knew were in Spanish, and all the books I read as a child were in Spanish. So you have something that you really want to share. Yes?
Two of my children were born in Japan, and my other children were also, you know, very young when we were in Japan, and I spoke to them in Japanese, and learned to. I used to practice reading the children's books so that I could read them with a decent amount of fluency to them. You know, I have to practice reading them beforehand before reading them to the children. But and then my reading ability, I think, improved as my children got older, and I was having to read more complex books to them. But I knew that they would learn English eventually. I wasn't worried about their English. I was more concerned that they got a good grounding in Japanese. So we spoke Japanese.
And there is really some evidence indicating that the OPOL, one parent, one language method, is not really the best for everyone, that if you really want a child to be more balanced bilingual, you should do more for the home language. So in this case, you decided for Japanese because you probably knew you were coming here. So it's really what fits every family. With regards to mixing, I don't see this as a big problem because you see that in some countries this is what happens. People mix and they use more than two languages. And there is even, I don't know if you're familiar with the concept of translanguaging, but there are many places in Europe in particular, this is becoming very popular. And translanguaging basically means, instead of thinking of separate languages, allowing children, at least for in the beginning stages when they migrate to a country, to use any linguistic resources that they have. So people switch between languages, and they still acquire languages. You go to Malaysia and children speak 3-4 languages. Probably in Switzerland it's the same. People just switch. So even if there is a bit of mixing, I don't think this is a big problem. Now, I talked about the emotional involvement with the parents, and I wanted to bring this study by Annick de Hoover, because she did a study on well-being in families, and she had data from thousands of families that they completed her surveys. So her study was on social-emotional well-being, and she identified that the well-being is negatively affected when the children do not speak the minority language. This is a study mostly conducted in Flanders with children who spoke Dutch and French, but also a variety of other minority languages. So the parents show a full range of negative emotions when the children didn't speak their languages. They blamed themselves for being a bad parent. They felt guilty for failing to transmit the home language. They felt embarrassed. They felt that the children rejected them because they didn't want to speak the language. They felt that they dissatisfied with the child reading practices, and more importantly, and I thought very sad, they felt a lack of emotional connection with the children when the children refused to speak the language, and they didn't do much about that. Now, from my experience raising a child, every child goes through a stage where they don't want to speak the home language. So it's a matter of persevere and using different strategies. But I think it's very important to be aware that there is a price to pay for parents when they don't use the same language as the children. In terms of the community and the society, well, children become full members of their communities if they speak more than one language. Of course, they can contribute to overseas society. They have better educational outcomes, as we saw with NAPLAN. They are intercultural competent citizens, etc. So there are benefits for everyone. So this is just to move into the next topic. All I need for Christmas is sufficient amount of exposure so I can reap all the benefits of being bilingual and also contribute to society.
That's nice.
Yeah. Okay, now why not? Why would people not raise bilingual children? There's a number of perceived disadvantages. Children might be a little bit late in speaking, not every child. And when it happens, it's usually 3 to 6 months delay, so this is not really a big price to pay. Another issue is the mixing of the languages. Again, that's very normal in the process of acquiring a language. If you talked about Switzerland, you probably get families where people switch into languages from one to the other, and it's really quite normal. But children acquire very early this awareness of what language to speak with whom. Sometimes they might not worry too much, but they do acquire this ability. So if they speak to you in Japanese and English, but they know that someone else doesn't speak English, they would probably speak just in Japanese, or vice versa. So, and as I said before, it's very normal in multilingual societies that people mix languages. But it's work. It's not the same. It's effort. It involves effort for parents and carers, and it's a long-term commitment. It's not something you do for a couple of years. It really have to persevere. They need a lot of language exposure, so you need to be sure that you are giving this language exposure. They need extra encouragement because, as I said, at some stage, and from my research, it's usually around the age of 4, they want to be like everyone else. They don't want to speak the other language, so they need encouragement to continue. You have to create a need for that to happen. To be consistent with language rules, and I talked to parents and they said, we have this practice, we speak this language at home, but we speak the majority language outside. Well, they're happy with this system. Some other parents have the one parent, one language. Some others have I read about this trilingual family who spoke the majority language outside, but on the way to school, the way from home to school was in one language and from school home in the other language. So every family has their own practices. And now it's an area of research, family language policy. So people look at management of bilingualism and multilingualism. Withstanding the peer pressure is very important because people tell you what, I don't know if this is your experience, but I had experiences of people telling me, you're living in Australia now, you should speak English. I don't know if you ever had this experience. Or they will tell you the children are going to be confused, their English is not going to be good enough, etc. So you have to know what you're doing. And this is why I go to schools and I talk to parents and teachers, because I think it's very important that they feel confident that the child is going to acquire English. English is protected, as I said, and stay in the course. And motivating the child. So I have the slide, the perfect slide for motivating the child. This might be a good idea.
No, didn't go to it.
Okay, maybe after this one. Okay, now continue. No, that's okay. Continue with work. Reading is going to be demanding, and this is the area where I think parents need most support. Reading and writing in two languages. Most of us don't really know how to teach literacy. So this is an area where we need help in a foreign language. It is additional academic work, so children are acquiring a second language as well as the first one. They can compete with requirements in schooling, and in particular if they go to community language schools or ethnic schools, so this is something that they might also object to. So access to resources might be an issue, not so much now with the internet, but when we came to Australia, finding materials in another language was really a problem. So extra motivation is necessary, and parents should ideally educate themselves about how best to teach literacy in their home language, because as I said, this is not something that comes natural to people, in particular with scripted languages. Attending weekend schools is probably beneficial, but again, it's another thing that parents have to fit in a busy schedule. Okay, this is the one for motivating, and you can use it with your students as well. Selected Spanish, now see if you can figure out how to get the money. So,
but I think that's that's very cute. But I know for my children too, now in the age of phones, my children are adults now. But we have a messenger chat with the grandparents in Japan, and so sometimes that's an opportunity to write. It's a lovely modern opportunity to write because the grandparents will send them a message. It's in our group chat. We can all see it, and they reply in Japanese.
Yeah, well, my daughter started to write a lot more in Spanish with the autocorrect with the phone, because she was very much of a perfectionist and she felt embarrassed about making mistakes. But with the autocorrect, suddenly she got the confidence, and now every message is in Spanish, which is great. Yeah. Okay, so now, I wanted to talk a little bit about the situation in Australia and introduce some of the projects that I've been conducting. We know that we have many opportunities in Australia with all the languages that people speak, but also many challenges. 26.3% of the population was born overseas in over 190 countries. So basically, almost every country in the world is represented in Australia. Migrants from English-speaking countries, UK, New Zealand, are still the largest group, but more than 1 in 5 Australians speaks a language other than English at home. So this is a great opportunity and a great challenge for the education system. 4% of the population speaks Mandarin Chinese, and 6 Asian countries are listed in the top 10 countries of birth. So in all, we have more than 300 distinct languages identified in the census, in addition to Aboriginal languages. But not all languages are equal. So Ruiz already in the 80s identified 3 policy orientations when it comes to educational policy. Languages can be seen as a right, the human right to educate, to get education in your own language. Languages can be seen as a problem or as a resource. So in Australia, there is a distinction, a clear distinction between modern foreign languages that are supported, some of them in the education system, indigenous languages, and migrant and community languages. But only a few languages are seen as resources. If you think about the education system in Australia, how many languages are represented or taught in schools? Any ideas? This is a genuine question. Yeah, but it's not really that many. When you think about 300 languages, it's not really that many. So some are resources because they are priority languages for Australia, either in terms of economic or financial interest, or in terms of security, or in terms of culture. But maybe we talk about 12, 15 languages. What happens to the others? So Lobianco has a quote, I think is very poignant, saying, languages spoken in other countries and divorced from daily life are seen as valuable skills. In contrast, when the languages are less foreign, when emotional attachment and mastery might be high, their study, public use, and maintenance threaten civilization, no longer a skill, but sedition. And I think this was from 2000, but things haven't changed that much. So what we have is here what I call the Australian paradox, and this is work I've done with my colleague Andrea Schale. We wrote in Language on the Move a little piece on that. So we have the following paradox. On the one hand, we know that there are benefits of bilingualism and literacy in the home language, but on the other hand, there is no institutional support for that. And I'm talking about children who are already fluent in particular languages, not children starting from scratch. So if a child speaks Spanish at home, for example, they might get all the benefits of bilingualism, but there is no institutional support for children who already speak the language. So this has detrimental effects for individuals and societies and creates a sense of disengagement from many young people in that case. But on the other hand, and this is the paradox, mastery of foreign languages is seen as an imperative in the age of globalization. And if you look at university mission statements, the role of languages is highlighted. So there is, and in the education system, there is some institutional support, but native speakers of other languages are not catered for. And I've been looking at ACARA, for example, or the ELA program. There are very few languages that have two streams. Chinese is one, but for most of the other languages is basically geared for students starting from the beginning, from scratch. So there is really very little support for other languages. So this is something that Cummings wrote in 2005, talking about Canada, but I think it really applies very much to the Australian context. We have a bizarre scenario of schools successfully transforming fluent speakers of foreign languages into monolingual English speakers, at the same time as they struggle largely unsuccessfully to transform English monolingual students into foreign language speakers. Now, I don't want to be all negative here because it sounds very negative, but I didn't do, I'm not responsible for the policy here. But we know everyone who teaches a language at university knows how many years it takes for people to acquire a good level of proficiency. And on the other hand, we have all these resources, children who are already fluent, who don't have the opportunity to develop literacy, and without literacy, they cannot really advance in all their languages. So this is the paradox that I see. But on the other hand, I do also acknowledge that there are many challenges because providing, migrants come from many different places, cultures, we said 190 countries, socioeconomic, educational backgrounds. In addition, the second most frequently spoken language in Australia, Chinese, Mandarin Chinese, is spoken by 4% of the population. This is very different from the situation of Spanish in the States, for example, when you have 12% of the population speaking the same language. So, in addition to the fact that the policy orientations are geared towards assimilation and switching to English, there are many practical constraints, and we have to agree to that. There are limitations in terms of materials, curriculum, teaching expertise in a variety of languages. How can the education system cope with 300 languages when people are living all over Australia? It's not like they are all concentrated in one particular area. So coping with linguistic diversity presents many challenges.
Do you think that in the United States they do a better job of catering to those native speakers or those native speakers of Spanish and developing their literacy than, or is it a similar situation?
I would like to say they do a better job only because people are more congregated in certain states and cities, but the bilingual schooling hasn't been a great success either. And in some, there was a referendum in California years ago about the bilingual schooling, and the Hispanic community doesn't vote as a bloc. So there were, in particular, Chileans, Argentinians, and Uruguayans were against bilingual schooling because they felt that the level of schooling wasn't at the same level as the level of schooling in English. So there are a number of issues there. So bilingual schools exist, but it's still not a success. But I'm generalizing. There might be some areas where it really works better. So, talking about bilingual schools, in Australia, this seems to be an optimal model of bilingual development, but the very rare in contemporary Australia, because language proficiency is mostly seen as mastery of English language skills. There are a few bilingual programs, and I'm very happy to know that there is the Japanese, so I would like to hear more from you later. So a few bilingual programs exist, but they target languages enough resources. And the system is really quite a stretch to cope with all this linguistic diversity. So this has a very negative impact on newly arrived children and on second and third generation migrants. As we know, the level of attrition documented in the census is very high. Usually after the second generation, the language is more or less gone. In the area of literacy, which is the most fragile skill, this is particularly noticeable. And children then end up talking what is called the kitchen languages. They can speak a bit, but not very fluently or proficiency, and the structures that they use are quite limited. If you don't develop literacy, it's difficult really to make progress. So Fishman, in '91, recognizing the challenges that linguistic diversity presents to systems, talked about parents taking more responsibility for the children's languages, rather than just depending on the educational institutions. So some initiatives that communities have taken, one is the community language schools in Australia. There are many, and I'm going to talk a little bit. And then I just want to mention two projects that I've been involved with. Well, the second I've been involved with, and the third one is about the Taiwanese community and what people are doing there. Next one. And I'm very aware of the time, so what time are you? Okay, good. Okay, so as you probably know, and some of you might be working in some ethnic schools. No? Okay. So there are many ethnic schools in Australia, about 1,000, according to their website. 1,000 community schools attended by about 100,000 children, offering programs in 69 languages. Now, 69 languages is impressive, but it's not 300 that they are spoken in this country, of course. But there are many challenges that the schools face. One is that tuition is usually conducted in addition to mainstream schooling, so the children have to go to another school, the parents have to drive them to another school. They are geographically spread, so not every language can be offered in each city or suburb or in rural areas. The range of students have different linguistic competencies, so balancing the level of proficiency of the kids with the age is also a challenge, because these children might be 12, but the materials that they can read or be exposed to are designed for much younger children, so this is very demotivating. and the lack of trained teachers and the scarcity of teaching materials suitable for the Australian context. So this was the reason why, even though I think ethnic schools are doing quite a good job, very different from the situation, for example, in Sweden, where if the district has 5 children who speak a language, the school has to provide mother tongue education or mother tongue instruction. And this means that the school hires a teacher that teaches for 1 hour a week in that language. Now, in a conference that I attended, one of these teachers, a Turkish teacher, gave a talk, and her talk was titled, "What can you do with 1 hour every week?" But the short answer was, well, more than if you didn't have that hour, because she managed to create a number of activities and develop activities with the kids that they felt proud of using that language in school. And I think in a way it's really to instill in children pride in the other language or the minority language. My colleague Andrea Shalley and I designed this pilot study trying to see whether children can develop literacy skills in a home language that they already speak without explicit instruction. And this would be a way of going around the fact that there is no institutional support for languages and that the fact that many parents cannot really drive children to different schools. So we wanted to see whether children can play computer games, because we know that children like playing computer games, and whether they can develop literacy skills using that. The idea came from one workshop we did on the importance of keeping the home language at the Logan Library. I don't know if someone has been to the Logan Library. It's a fantastic library, it's great.
The one next to the pool?
I don't know, I just went there to, in Logan, Logan City. Logan City. Yeah, it's a fantastic library, it's so modern. And I went there because they invited me to give a talk to parents on home language, and the librarian was telling me that in the school holidays, because the library is perceived as being a safe place, parents drop the children in the library and they go to work and they pick them up at the end of the day. And the children just sit there and play computer games. So I thought, okay, if children could play computer games and learn to write in their home language at the same time, this would be a win-win solution for everyone. Because it would be a good way of dealing with this linguistic diversity. Okay, sorry. So this is basically the reference. This is our youngest player. We did the pilot with German because we had very little money, and as you know, designing computer games is very expensive, but we got an internal grant from Griffith University with a game designer, and we did German because my colleague is German and she had children in that age, so we were trying to do something that we can control. So, sorry.
Go back. Sorry.
Okay, so the process. So basically, we designed 3 different games. We should be able to play a little bit.
Oh, this one?
Yeah. So in this one, they had 3 games. In one, they had to pop up the bubbles that they had the word there, and they were competing against the computer. Okay, well, the quality is not very good. It's a pity because the child was so excited. Okay. In any case, we had 10 children participating in the study. We did a before and after test. We hired a teacher, a German teacher, so she could do the before and after testing. And this is by one example of learning. This is a child that was 7. We had children from 5 to 8. No, this was 8 then. And this is the before, the pre-test, and the post-test. Now, one thing that becomes quite obvious here is that this child had acquired the principle of capitalizing nouns. So every noun on the right side is capitalized, which is what you have to do in English, so in German. So this is evidence that the child couldn't have acquired that from English literacy. So obviously they saw something. They also had to, well, this was one of the tests. The other is initially the pre-test. They have to write words, and this child wrote 4 words in the beginning. As you see, in the post-test, he could do more, and then they had to write syllables. Now, well, we can say there was, so in general we did this. The children played these games. It was encouraging that we saw some gains there, some things that they couldn't have acquired from English literacy. The child that I'm showing you played for 2 hours and a half. So 2.5 hours of play, and without the parents being there. Now, quite encouraging, but we still need to evaluate that. What they particularly liked was the competitiveness and the feedback provision of the game. So with the hands, there was something that they had to push the hand, and they had to be faster than the artificial intelligence, but the children, for some reason, believed that there was another child playing against them, so they got really competitive and did very well. So these are the sort of things that motivated the children. Oh,
you want me to go back?
Yeah, if you can go 1 second. So it was quite encouraging, but a small pilot, and it would be great, and our idea was to replicate it at some stage with Chinese, but the problem is the funding for that. But in a way, it would be a great way, I mean, if it works, because you can involve the communities in creating content, and then you can bypass all the limitations and the challenges that we mentioned that are posed by such linguistic diversity. And the final project that I wanted to, well, it's not a project, the final initiative I want to discuss. We published it recently, and it's called Home and Away, Sojourning for Educational Purposes. Now, this is a family language management activity that we didn't initiate, we just documented because we heard that the Taiwanese parents were taking the children to Taiwan during the school holidays. So you might be very familiar with that initiative, but we thought it was very interesting, so we wanted to know more. So in the Australian holiday, these children go to Taiwan and they go to school over there. Okay, so why Taiwanese? Well, because the Taiwanese do it. And also, they can do it, why? Because Taiwan accepts dual citizenship. So these children are Taiwanese citizens, so they can go to school there and they don't have to pay, unlike children in other countries. Anecdotal evidence indicates that this is a very common phenomenon, and we did a survey initially to identify participants, and we found very quickly 20 families who did that. The problem is most parents didn't want to be interviewed, and we thought maybe they feel that we're going to have a negative reaction to the fact that the children go to school for the whole year and then they go to school again. Your kids did, yeah, and the children, well, so Mandarin, well, was the largest minority language spoken in Australia, so we can see that Mandarin, I think, has a big advantage over other languages because it's both a community language and a priority language. And there is a big community, and there is well supported, and parents have a lot of respect for education and appreciation for educational things. So in that sense, it was good to do that, to look at this community.
I think all my colleagues at the Gold Coast campus, at least in Japanese,
they do that as well.
Have taken their kids back to Japan for the holidays, at least the long Christmas holidays.
Yeah, but do they go to school?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, and school, and it doesn't cost anything.
I need to interview more people. Yeah.
And when we lived in Japan, I brought them here. So yeah, children just went to school their whole lives.
Yeah.
I went for 3 months, and my kids went to primary school there in Germany.
Yeah.
And then my son went a whole year to stay with his grandparents, and he went to the Gymnasium, that's the high school there, the
Yes.
academic one. And he wanted to do that himself. First he said he didn't understand because he didn't know, the words for history and
Yeah.
mathematics. At the end of the year he got an award.
Oh, nice.
So he learned it really good. He
Yeah.
came back fluent.
Lovely. Sorry.
Yeah. And my youngest daughter went for 3 months.
Yeah, well, I took my daughter for 4 months to Argentina, but she was very fluent already, and she did very well in school.
Yeah,
The first time she got the congratulation from her principal for doing so well, she said, "Of course, my mother is a linguist." Okay. But we were not familiar with this phenomenon to the extent, because many people reply that they do that, but then only 6 agreed to be interviewed, and then 2 others completed surveys online.
Did she think it was genetic?
Of what?
That her mother was a linguist?
Probably. Maybe the mother was spending a lot of time with her, helping with homework. This probably was more likely, yes. Now, unfortunately, we couldn't interview the children because this would have allowed a better impression or image of what, or better understanding of what they did, because we only interviewed the mothers. Not that we looked for the mothers, but the mothers are the ones who take the children in these particular communities. All these mothers were married to Australian or New Zealand husbands who were very supportive of them going for 2 months and taking the kids. So it would be interesting to see what the children feel about that. But what the mothers expressed, so the mothers might not have told the whole story because everyone was very positive. But of course, but it might be true that it was a very positive experience. But for example, they never mentioned anything about the challenges. Everything was quite positive in the way they explained it. And they documented linguistic gains, issues of confidence in speaking the language. Yeah, I'm not going to read all the comments, but so the benefits were linguistic, sociocultural, developing intercultural understanding, and opportunity to learn about different cultures that were the cultures of the mothers. Develop reflexiveness, including one child who said, "Oh, I'm so glad I studied in Australia because here the children study a lot more." So they were really happy, but they were comparing constantly, which is interesting. Improve independence, for example, the fact that the children were responsible for cleaning up the room before they left and things that they were not exposed before. Affective, a bonding experience with the mother, opportunities of knowing the mother's background and having an extended relations with the grandparents and the rest of the family. Now, one of the things we wonder is what is the long-term ability of these parents to continue, because I guess at some point it will become a lot more difficult with literacy as well. The children were doing well, but they started in kindergarten and they were in year 2 or 3, the oldest, but I don't know how long they can keep this up, because some of the mothers were already expressing concerns that the content will become very difficult at some stage. But there were a number of issues that facilitated this experience. One was that the parents were the teachers were very supportive, both in Australia and in Taiwan. In Australia, for example, some of the families said that the teachers allowed them to be away to take a longer holiday so that they could stay in Taiwan because they were studying after all. And the Taiwanese teachers allocated a classmate to one child, or the child was allowed to go with the cousin to another school. So there was a lot of help from the mothers. A lot of organization went into this activity. So this is really an individual management activity. The children also have an adequate level of Mandarin proficiency, and we were very pleasantly surprised because initially we thought, okay, the parents might think, well, the child doesn't really need to do more in Mandarin because they will be going to school anyway. But no, the parents had either private tutors or community schools in Mandarin, so to ensure that the child was going to be able to cope with the demands. And they also had the father's support, because the father had to say, okay, you can take the child for 2 months. And in a way, it was also facilitated by the fact that there was a lower socioeconomic status in this community and these particular families, because the mothers were not working for 2 months, which is not something that everyone can do. Okay, so these were just two issues I wanted to raise, or 2 projects. One is one that we conducted, the pilot, and this one is happening in the community. We just documented that. What was interesting with the Taiwanese initiative is that even though the parents were talking about linguistic development and the fact that they were doing this for the language, when you interview them, there are other issues, because the mother said, well, one of the things you have to tell people is not to be too tough on children, let them have fun. The most important thing is that they like it, that they like Taiwan, that they don't have a bad experience. So in a way, it was really more emotional and affective than linguistic, even though parents described it in linguistic terms. Okay, this is just my Facebook page. Home language maintenance, this is the advertisement. No, I'm basically uploading, I'm running this with one of my colleagues. We are co-chairing an international research network on home language maintenance. And as I said, there are so many benefits in bilingualism, but people don't really get to know, so this is for the community. And a number of the posts that we uploaded, and I didn't mention this now, today, have to do with disabilities, because people might say, well, with non-disabled children it's easy. There is a lot of evidence that children who are autistic or deaf, there are a number of areas, learning disability, that children do benefit from a bilingual upbringing as well. So these are all sort of posts that I think could benefit the community, so please like us if you want. And this is also how you can contact me. Okay, no, I'm not going to show this because it's just too much. So thank you very much. I'll be very happy to discuss any of these issues further. And as I mentioned, I do go to schools. There are a number of principals that invite me every year to talk to parents or teachers, and I'll be very happy to come. And in many cases, I noticed that it's now English teachers, the ESL teachers that are inviting me. So they are very supportive of bilingualism, which I think is a welcome change. So,
any questions?
Any questions? Yes.
Allow me one. It's basically back to your initial question about when do you start talking about people being bi or multilingual. I had that conversation with a couple of year 12 students, when the dinosaurs roamed more than 10 years ago. And this was a girl who had been on a 6 weeks exchange to France, came back, and she realized that she was actually dreaming in the other language. So we ended up having a lengthy chat in class about, okay, what language do you think in? What language do you dream in? And we got some really interesting discussion going, and of course I made the mistake of then confessing that I actually didn't think in a language. So of course my students will say, I just didn't think, haha. Anyway, but be that as it may, is there any research done on to what extent the language that you use in your thought, in your mind, and in your dreams actually defines your bilingualism?
You know, I do have to say I agree with your answer to the student. I don't think we speak in a language. We think in a language. I think we translate very quickly into a language that is almost like an automatic translation. But of course, you know, this is my feeling, and this is, you know, based on some research. But the question, you know, the jury is out there still about whether you really think in a language or not, or whether thinking is more like a mental process that you translate into a particular language very quickly. With regards to dreaming, I do dream sometimes in English, but my experience is that I have this meta-linguistic awareness that I'm going to say something in English now, so it's like I see myself saying something in another, so I'm very aware, it's not what comes naturally. So dreams are very interesting. The other interesting area is emotions, and there is a lot of work being done now in emotions, whether the language we speak determines how we look at different emotions. But all these topics are really worthy of a lot more investigation, I would say. And it's very difficult really to find evidence for one way or another.
But from my experience, when I first, I lived first 8.5 years in South Africa before I came here. So first, when I started to speak English, I actually thought first in German and had to translate. And then I think later I actually think in the language I speak at that moment. That's what I think when I'm in Germany and speak German, I think German, and when I'm here, I think English. That's what I think I do.
Yeah, well, but how can we prove one way or the other? But I think I do think that there is if maybe we really think of it in a sort of mental process, and then we transfer very quickly or translate very quickly. I found it easier to speak about certain topics in English than in Spanish, for example, because, and this is the area of function, everything I read about linguistics is in English, so I found it a lot easier to talk about that in English than in other areas. And you probably find yourself, counting is another one. In what language do you count? Because
mental arithmetic, I heard, what your strongest language.
Yeah.
You do your mental arithmetic in.
But you teach here and you learn, and I think it's when you use a certain language, when you teach also, you have certain words that you do not use in your mother tongue, so you would know what they are in your mother tongue because you know
exactly.
them only in English, and that happened to me too.
Yeah.
I did once a contract for mathematics, and not that I'm a math teacher, but in Germany school is a bit more difficult than here. So I did it, but I needed to watch the hard to learn the English terms for mathematics because I went to school in Germany and I didn't know. And then I taught them and then it worked fine, but I didn't know before what it is.
Yeah, and this is why I was talking about the different dimensions in bilingualism, because we are not equally strong in all the areas. In your case, mathematics could be stronger in a particular language, but some other areas of knowledge would be
I have a question from
stronger in another language.
Yeah.
So
I think it's in certain areas, like if you do medical language, I would not know how to say terms, translate them.
Yeah.
And let's face it, some words you can actually not translate from one language to another. It's sowieso impossible to actually say in English what Fingerspitzengefühl in German would be. There's just no word for it.
Yeah, we have a lot of words in German that don't exist in the English language. You just have to explain them, but there is no word here. That is really true, yeah.
Just have a question from one of our online participants. So when parents are communicating with young children, parents often mix languages as well. Is it better to stay one at a time when speaking to younger children?
If the parents speak the same language, I think it's better to just keep to that language. Now, if the parents speak two languages, in that case, it will be a family where parents mix languages. So I think the best strategy is to do whatever comes naturally in the family, because otherwise it creates an artificial situation for the parents as well if they have to restrict and change their practices. But whatever they do, if they're consistent, I think this is what the secret here is consistency. I would rather, in my case it was very easy because my husband and I speak Spanish, so it was really easy. But if you speak two different languages, it is quite natural that you would mix.
But then again, when you have people, when you are here in Australia and you have guests or they have friends over, my kids would never have spoken German because they would have thought it's rude if you speak the other language.
Yeah.
So as soon as somebody else is there, you speak English.
Well, my colleague Andrea, whose child you saw playing with the computer games, they only spoke German at home. Now they live in Sweden. They've been there for about 2 or 3 years, and the children are have a native competence in Sweden, but at home they still speak German. And I just spent a month with them, and my German improved a lot during that month. So I went to Sweden to improve my German. Their English, though, is deteriorating very rapidly, but she's not really worried because they will pick it up in school.
Yeah.
Now, this is the problem with mother tongue education in Germany, in Sweden. You are entitled to the 1 hour, but not to 2 languages. So if the child speaks 2 languages, you have to pick up one. So there are always limits because otherwise you will have so many languages that have to be offered. But in their case, they have to decide for German or English, and they decided German because English is very strong in Sweden anyway. But if you have more languages, more challenges, but it's not impossible at all. And as I said, even children with disabilities do well. Because if the family speaks a particular language at home, this child is going to be excluded if they don't speak that language.
Well, thanks very much, Susana. I'm
Okay,
sure so
thank you
many
for-
of those things resonated with us. I have a lot of friends where the mother is Japanese and the father is Australian, and yeah, they speak the different languages. But when I come and speak Japanese, I can just see the bewilderment on the face. Just, it's not how it works. But yeah, I'm sure there's a lot of things along the lines there. I also just remembered climbing a mountain in Tokyo with my kids who were at high school and learning the periodic table, and I was astonished to find out that they knew that AG was Gin, but they didn't know Gin was silver.
Oh, okay.
And AU was Kin, so they learned all those things, and it was so weird for me because I'd learned all those concepts in I guess in English
But again, this links to the issue of the areas of competence.
Yeah, and they passed their test.
Yeah. So so it can be done.
Yeah. So thanks very, very much.
Thank you for inviting me.
It was great.
And thank you for coming.
Everybody for coming.